Sometimes the loneliest souls find each other in the most forgotten places. There's something powerful about broken people healing together, creating family where none existed before. Silas Boone thought he'd won just an old mansion in a card game, but he discovered something far more precious. Deep in Wolf Hollow sat a house where two young women had survived alone, raised wild after losing everything. They didn't trust humans anymore, moved like shadows, and spoke in whispers. But Silas saw past their fear to the sharp minds underneath. He had patience where the world had shown them cruelty. Slowly, carefully, they began to trust. What started as three strangers sharing a roof became something beautiful, a family built on respect, understanding, and second chances. Could a mountain man and two wolf-raised sisters really make a home together? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, Silas. Boone had spent the better part of 63 years learning that solitude was a man's most reliable companion. His hand-carved walking stick, worn smooth by decades of mountain trails, tapped against the rocky path as he made his way through the dense Montana wilderness toward Wolf Hollow. The stick had been with him longer than any human soul, carved from a lightning-struck pine during his first winter alone in the mountains. It bore the scars of countless journeys and the weight of a lifetime's worth of stories. The morning mist clung to the towering pines, like memories refusing to fade, and Silas paused to catch his breath, not from exertion, but from the strange anticipation that had been building in his chest since he'd won that poker game 3 days prior. He'd never been a gambling man, not really. But when Hank Barrow had thrown the deed to some forgotten mansion on the table with a sneer, something had stirred in Silas's weathered heart. "Wolf Hollow," Hank had said, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt reserved for things that couldn't fight back. "Ain't nobody lived there in nigh on 15 years. Place is cursed, they say. Strange sounds, stranger sights. You want it, old man? Take it off my hands." Silas had studied his cards, 3 kings staring back at him like old friends, and felt something shift in the smoky saloon air. Maybe it was the whiskey, maybe it was the way the other men had gone quiet, waiting to see if the legendary mountain man still had any fight left in him. Or maybe it was just the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd spent too many winters talking only to himself and the wind. The game had ended quickly after that. Hank's confidence had crumbled along with his full house, and Silas had walked out of that saloon with a deed to property he'd never seen, in a place most folks crossed themselves when mentioning. But as he'd folded that yellowed paper into his coat pocket, he'd felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope. Now, 3 days later, with his few possessions packed on his back and his walking stick marking each step toward an uncertain future, Silas wondered if he'd finally lost what sense the mountains had beaten into him. Wolf Hollow had earned its name honestly, the townspeople whispered. Packs of wolves roamed those dense woods, bolder and smarter than anywhere else in Montana. But it wasn't the wolves that kept decent folks away. It was the stories. Stories of lights moving through the mansion at night when no soul should be there. Stories of wild figures darting between the trees, too quick and too strange to be natural. Stories of a plague that had swept through the hollow 15 years back, taking whole families and leaving nothing but empty houses and questions that nobody wanted answered. The path narrowed as Silas climbed higher into the hollow, the canopy growing so thick that noon felt like twilight. Ancient trees pressed close on both sides, their branches interwoven like arthritic fingers, and the very air seemed to whisper warnings. This was old forest, the kind that remembered. When buffalo thundered across these mountains and native tribes left offerings for spirits that wiped. Men had never learned to respect. Silas's boots crunched through layers of pine needles and fallen leaves, each step taking him deeper into a world that time seemed to have forgotten. The silence here wasn't the comfortable quiet of high mountain peaks. It was watchful, waiting, alive with unseen eyes and held breaths. More than once he caught movement in his peripheral vision, but when he turned, there was nothing but shadow and the swaying of branches in a breeze he couldn't feel. His walking stick found the rhythm of the trail, And Silas let his mind wander to the poker game that had changed everything. Hank Barrow wasn't known for his generosity, and the ease with which he'd wagered that deed still puzzled Silas. Men like Hank held onto property the way wolves held onto meat, with teeth and determination. Either the place truly was worthless, cursed as folks claimed, or there was something Hank knew that he wasn't sharing. The mansion revealed itself gradually, like a secret the forest was reluctant to tell. First came the stone pillars of what had once been a grand entrance, now wrapped in ivy and standing sentinel over a drive that had surrendered to wildflowers and saplings. Then the roofline emerged through the trees, slate tiles green with moss and age, some missing entirely where winter storms had taken their toll. When Silas finally stepped into the clearing that surrounded the house, his breath caught in his throat. The mansion rose before him like something from a half-remembered dream. 3 stories of weathered stone and timber that spoke of wealth and ambition from a time when such things seemed possible in these remote mountains. Tall windows stared down at him, some boarded up, others dark as empty sockets. And ivy had claimed most of the lower walls, giving the entire structure the appearance of something being slowly reclaimed by the earth itself. But it was beautiful still, in the way that ruins often are, haunted by the memory of what it had been, and dignified by its refusal to simply collapse and disappear. Someone had built this place with love and hope, had imagined family gatherings in those spacious rooms and children's laughter echoing through those empty halls. The thought brought an unexpected tightness to Silas's chest, a recognition of dreams that had lived and died within those walls. He approached slowly, his walking stick tapping against the stone steps that led to the massive front door. The wood was solid oak, dark with age and weather, and when he pressed his palm against it, he felt the weight of history and the stubborn strength that had kept this place standing through 15 years of abandonment. That's when he saw them, a flash of movement in an upstairs window. Quick as lightning and twice as startling, Silas froze, his hand still pressed against the door, and stared up at the second floor. For a moment, there was nothing, just the dark rectangle of a window frame and the shadows beyond. Then so brief he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. A pale face appeared in the glass, wild hair framing features that were too distant to make out clearly. The face vanished almost immediately. But Silas had lived too many years in country where observation meant survival to doubt what he'd seen. Someone or something was in his house. The deed in his pocket suddenly felt heavier, and he found himself questioning not just his sanity in accepting this place, but his safety in approaching it. He stood there for long minutes, watching the windows and listening to the forest around him. The silence was complete now, even the birds having gone quiet, as if the entire hollow was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Silas had faced down grizzlies and mountain lions, had survived blizzards that would have killed lesser men. But this felt different, not dangerous in the way of claws and teeth, but unsettling in a way that reached deep into primitive parts of his mind. Finally, he stepped back from the door and began a slow circuit of the house, his walking stick at the ready and his eyes scanning every window, every shadow, every place where someone might be watching. The mansion was larger than he'd first realized, with wings extending back into the trees and a kitchen garden that had gone wild with weeds and volunteer plants. Somewhere in that tangle, he caught the scent of herbs, sage and something else, something that spoke of knowledge and careful tending. As he rounded the corner toward the back of the house, he found more evidence of habitation. A small fire pit, recently used, with ashes that were grey but not ancient. Tracks in the soft earth near what had once been a well, not boot prints, but bare feet and small ones at that. And hanging from a line strung between 2 trees, clothing that had been washed and left to dry in the mountain air. The clothing stopped him cold. Drew dresses, simple and well-mended, sized for young women rather than children. They hung motionless in the still air, and something about their presence, so normal, so human, sent a chill down Silas's spine that had nothing to do with the cooling afternoon. He wasn't alone in Wolf Hollow. and whoever shared this place with him was very much alive, very much present and very much aware of his arrival. The question that remained was whether they were friend or foe, and whether an old mountain man with nothing but a deed and a lifetime of solitude had just walked into something far more complicated than he'd bargained for. The shadows were growing longer, and night in Wolf Hollow promised to be unlike any he'd ever experienced. But Silas Boone had come too far to turn back now, and something deep in his weathered heart whispered that perhaps, after all these years of talking only to the wind, he was finally about to have some interesting company. His walking stick found its rhythm again as he completed his circuit of the house, and with each step he felt the weight of unseen eyes following his every move. The front door yielded to Silas's touch with a groan that echoed through the hollow like a warning. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light that slanted through grimy windows, and the air inside carried the musty weight of years, undisturbed. But underneath that staleness, Silas detected something else, the faint but unmistakable scent of recent habitation. Wood smoke, cooked food, and the indefinable essence of lives being lived within these walls. The entry hall stretched before him, grand even in its decay. A staircase swept upward in an elegant curve, its banister carved from what looked like cherry wood, though years of neglect had dulled its finish to the color of old blood. Portrait frames hung empty on the walls, their subjects long since removed or rotted away, leaving only dark rectangles against faded wallpaper that had once been blue, but now looked grey as storm clouds. Silas stepped carefully across the threshold, his boots loud against the warped wooden floors. Every instinct told him to announce himself, to call out a greeting and establish his peaceful intentions. But something about the watching silence made him hold his tongue. This felt like a place where sudden movements and loud voices might trigger something best left sleeping. He made his way deeper into the house, his walking stick tapping softly against the floor. The parlor to his right held the ghostly shapes of furniture draped in dusty sheets, like mourners frozen in perpetual grief. The dining room beyond showed signs of more recent use, a long table cleared of dust, chairs arranged with military precision, and plates stacked neatly on a sideboard as if someone had been expecting company. It was in the library that Silas found the first real proof of the house's current inhabitants. Books had been pulled from their shelves and arranged in careful piles on a reading table. Not randomly, but with purpose, volumes on botany, basic medicine, and survival techniques grouped together like a curriculum. Someone had been teaching themselves, and recently, but it was the artifact he discovered tucked between the pages of a botanical guide that truly stopped him in his tracks. A torn family portrait, its edges ragged as if it had been ripped apart in haste or fury, then carefully pieced back together with what looked like tree sap and determination. The painting showed a prosperous family, a man with kind eyes and a carefully groomed beard, a woman whose dress spoke of wealth and refinement, and between them, two young girls with bright smiles and ribbons in their hair. The bottom portion of the portrait, where names might have been inscribed, was too damaged to read, but the faces were clear enough. The girls in the painting, though younger, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the wild-haired figure he'd glimpsed in the upstairs window. The same delicate bone structure, the same wide-set eyes that seemed to hold secrets. A soft sound from above froze Silas in place. Footsteps, light as a cat's paws, moving across the floor of the room directly overhead. Then silence, as if whoever was up there had suddenly realized they weren't alone, and was now listening as intently as he was. Silas set the portrait carefully back where he'd found it and moved toward the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight, despite his efforts to move quietly, and he could almost feel the tension building in the house around him, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The second-floor hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors that stood mostly closed. Dust lay thick on the floor, but disturbed patches showed where feet had passed recently. Silas followed the trail, his heart beating faster than it had any right to in a man his age. The trail led to a door at the end of the hall, the room that would correspond to the window where he'd seen the face. Silas approached slowly, every sense heightened. He could hear breathing now, soft and rapid from behind the door. Not one person, but two, their breaths slightly out of sync, like a nervous harmony. He raised his hand to knock, then thought better of it. Instead, he spoke softly through the wood, his voice carrying all the gentleness he could manage. "I know you're there," he said, "and I know you're scared, but I'm not here to hurt you or drive you away. My name is Silas Boone, and I reckon this house belongs to me now, but that doesn't mean we can't share it peacefully." The breathing stopped entirely, as if his words had turned the occupants to stone. Silas waited, counting heartbeats before continuing. "I found the portrait downstairs. Pretty little girls they were. I'm guessing that was you, some years back, before whatever happened here happened. I don't know your story, but I know something about being alone in the world. Maybe we can figure this out together." A soft sound came through the door, not quite a whisper, not quite a whimper. It was followed by the creak of floorboards as someone moved closer to the door. Then, so faint he almost missed it, a voice spoke. "Go away." The words were in English, though they carried the careful pronunciation of someone who hadn't spoken the language in a very long time. The voice was young, female, and sharp with fear and defiance. "I could," Silas said reasonably. "But this is a big house, and winter's coming on. Seems foolish for any of us to be alone when we could be helping each other stay warm and fed." A longer pause. Then a different voice, slightly higher. "You're the man from the poker game." This surprised Silas. "You know about that?" "We watch the town sometimes. From the trees. People talk about the mountain man who won the cursed house from Hank Barrow." The way she said Hank's name carried a weight of hatred that made Silas's chest tighten. Whatever history existed between these girls and Hank Barrow, it wasn't pleasant. "What do you know about Hank Barrow?" he asked. The silence stretched so long he thought they'd decided not to answer. Then the first voice spoke again, cold as winter water. "He killed our parents." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He leaned against the doorframe, suddenly understanding why these girls lived like ghosts in their own home, why they trusted no one, why they watched the town from the safety of the forest. "How?" he asked simply. "Poison in the well. Made it look like the plague that took the others. But we saw him. We were small, but we weren't stupid. We hid in the root cellar when he came back to make sure everyone was dead." Silas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of truth in those words. Hank Barrow hadn't lost that deed in a poker game. He'd wagered it because he thought it was worthless, because he believed everyone who might have a claim to it was long dead. "How long have you been living here alone?" he asked. 15 years, the second voice whispered. "Since we were 7 and 8. 7 and 8 years old, left to survive in the wilderness after watching their parents murdered." The magnitude of what these girls had endured, what they'd had to become to stay alive, settled over Silas like a heavy blanket. No wonder they moved like wild things. No wonder they trusted no one. "What are your names?" he asked gently. Another long pause. "Then to Kira, and this is Luna." "Kira and Luna," Silas repeated, tasting the names like fine whiskey. "Those are beautiful names. Your parents chose well." The floorboards creaked again, and he heard whispered conversation too low to make out. Finally, Luna's voice came through the door. "Why should we trust you? You could be working for him." "I could be," Silas agreed. "But if I were, would I be standing here talking through a door? Would I have told you my real name? Would I be asking permission to share a house that's legally mine?" More whispered consultation. Then Kira spoke. "Show us the deed." Silas pulled the yellowed paper from his coat and slid it under the door. He heard the rustle as it was picked up, then quiet voices discussing what they were seeing. After several minutes, the deed reappeared. "It's real," Luna said, and there was something like wonder in her voice. "Hank Barrow really lost our house." "Your house?" Silas asked. "Our father was Marcus Whitmore. This was Whitmore Manor before the plague came. Before Hank decided he wanted our land more than he wanted us alive." Silas felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. The Whitmore name was legendary in these parts, one of the first families to strike it rich in the Montana goldfields, wealthy enough to build a mansion in the wilderness and live like royalty among the pines. If these girls were Marcus Whitmore's daughters, they were heirs to more than just this house. Kira, Luna, he said carefully, I think we need to have a longer conversation. And I think we need to have it face to face. Because if you're who you say you are, and if Hank Barrow did what you say he did, then there's more at stake here than just a place to sleep. The silence that followed was different, not the frozen quiet of fear, but the thoughtful pause of minds working through possibilities. Finally, the door opened just a crack, and Silas found himself looking into a pair of eyes that were both wild and intelligent. Fearful and calculating, the inciting incident had begun, and nothing would ever be the same for any of them. The door remained open just that crack for what felt like an eternity, one green eye studying Silas with an intensity that reminded him of the mountain cats that had occasionally crossed his path. Calculating, wary, ready to bolt at the first sign of threat. Behind that visible eye, he could sense movement, whispered consultation, a whole conversation happening in glances and gestures he wasn't privy to. Finally, the door opened wider, and Silas got his first clear look at the Whitmore sisters. They were small, both of them, though whether from genetics or years of subsistence living, he couldn't tell. Kira, the one whose eye he'd been studying, appeared to be the elder by perhaps a year. Her dark hair fell in waves past her shoulders, clean but untamed, woven through with small braids that held feathers and what looked like polished stones. Luna stood slightly behind her sister, blonde hair catching the light from the hallway window, and around her throat hung something that made Silas's breath catch, a crude leather collar, obviously handmade, with markings that looked almost like pack symbols. Both girls were dressed in the simple dresses he'd seen hanging on the line, but their feet were bare and tough as leather, and they moved with a fluid grace that spoke of years spent navigating rough terrain. What struck him most, though, was their eyes. Wild, yes, but sharp with intelligence and a wariness that had been earned through hard experience. The wolves, Silas said softly, nodding toward Luna's collar. You weren't just hiding from Hank Barrow all these years. Luna's hand went instinctively to the collar, her fingers tracing the markings. They found us the second winter, she said, her voice still careful, still testing each word before releasing it. We were starving, didn't know how to hunt properly, didn't know which plants were safe to eat. The pack leader was old, wise. She took us in, taught us to survive, Kira added, to move quietly, to track, to understand the forest. They became our family when we had no one else. Silas nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him. These girls hadn't just survived in the wilderness. They'd been adopted by it, raised by creatures who'd seen something worth protecting in two traumatized children. The collar wasn't a mark of wildness, but a badge of belonging, a symbol of the pack that had saved their lives. Do they still come around? He asked. Sometimes, Kira said. Less now that we're older, more capable. But they watch over us still. They know you're here. That explained the feeling of being observed that had followed him through the forest. Silas found the thought oddly comforting rather than threatening. If the wolves had protected these girls for over a decade, they were probably better guardians than most humans he'd known. I'd like to hear more, he said. About the wolves, about how you've survived, about your parents. But maybe we could sit somewhere more comfortable. I'm getting too old to have important conversations standing in hallways. The sisters exchanged another of their silent communications, then Kira stepped back, gesturing for him to follow. They led him to what had once been a family sitting room, where furniture had been arranged around a small fireplace. The room showed clear signs of regular use. A stack of firewood neatly arranged, hand-woven blankets folded precisely, and books scattered on a low table as if someone had been reading just before his arrival. Silas lowered himself carefully into what had probably once been Marcus Whitmore's favorite chair, feeling the weight of history and tragedy in the worn leather. The sisters remained standing, poised near the doorway, as if they might need to flee at any moment. Tell me about your routine, Silas said, settling his walking stick against his knee. How do you live? What do you eat? How do you stay warm in winter? For the next hour, the sisters painted a picture of survival that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. They rose with the sun and slept when darkness fell, following rhythms that the wolves had taught them. They hunted small game with snares and deadfalls they'd learned to build, supplemented their diet with berries, nuts, and edible plants they'd identified through careful trial and observation. In winter, they retreated to the lower floors of the mansion, blocking off unused rooms and heating only what they needed with wood they gathered throughout the warmer months. We tried to keep the house from falling apart completely, Luna explained, gesturing toward repairs that Silas was only now noticing. Fixed the roof where we could reach it, cleared the chimney every spring, made sure the foundation stayed solid. You've done remarkable work, Silas said, and meant it. Looking around the room with fresh eyes, he could see the careful maintenance, the thoughtful preservation of a home that could have easily collapsed into ruin during 15 years of abandonment. We read every book in Father's library, Kira said. Taught ourselves what we could about building, farming, medicine. The wolves taught us to survive, but we had to teach ourselves to live. Silas was beginning to understand the full scope of what he'd stumbled into. These weren't wild children who'd reverted to animal behavior. They were intelligent young women who'd created their own unique culture, blending human knowledge with the hard wisdom of the natural world. They'd not just survived their trauma, they'd transcended it, becoming something new and remarkable. The townspeople, he said carefully. What do they know about you? They think we're dead, Luna said. We let them think that. Safer that way, but you've watched them. You knew about the poker game, Kira nodded. We go down sometimes at night. Listen to conversations, learn what's happening in the world outside. We know about the railroad coming through, about the mining operations expanding. We know Hank Barrow has been buying up land all through the valley. Building an empire on graves, Luna said bitterly. Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling evening air. If Hank had been systematically acquiring property in the area, and if he'd been willing to commit murder to get it, then the sisters were in more danger than even they realized. The fact that they were still alive, still in possession of valuable land, made them a threat to whatever larger scheme Hank was running. How much do you know about your father's will? He asked. About what he left you? Everything, Kira said simply. We found his papers years ago, hidden in a safe behind the bookshelf. We learned to read legal documents the same way we learned everything else, slowly, carefully, until we understood every word. Then you know that we own more than just this house, Luna finished. That our father had mining claims, timber rights, water rights, that we're worth more alive than Hank ever imagined when he decided to kill us. The sisters had grown still, their earlier wariness replaced by something harder, more determined. They weren't just survivors, they were heirs to a fortune, and they knew it. The question that remained was what they intended to do with that knowledge. As if reading his thoughts, Kira spoke. We've been waiting, Mr. Boone, waiting until we were old enough, strong enough, smart enough to reclaim what's ours, waiting for the right moment to come out of the shadows. And now, Silas asked. The sisters looked at each other, and in that look he saw years of shared struggle, shared planning, shared determination. They'd been preparing for this moment since they were children, and now finally they were ready. Now, Luna said, her hand touching the wolf collar at her throat. We think that moment might have arrived. Outside, somewhere in the deepening twilight, a wolf howled, long, mournful, and wild. It was answered by another, then another, until the entire hollow rang with their voices. The pack was calling, and the sisters were listening, and Silas realized that he'd just become part of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple property dispute. The next morning brought the first real test of their tentative alliance. Silas woke to find frost coating the windows and his breath visible in the cold air of the small room the sisters had allowed him to use. Downstairs he could hear movement, quiet, purposeful sounds that spoke of an established routine being carefully maintained. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he found both sisters preparing what looked like a meager breakfast. They moved around each other with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to share limited space and resources, never getting in each other's way, communicating through glances and subtle gestures that required no words. "Morning," he said softly, not wanting to startle them. Kira looked up from the small fire she was tending in the old wood stove. "There's coffee," she said. "Of sorts. We make it from chicory and whatever else we can find." "Sounds perfect," Silas replied, accepting the tin cup Luna handed him. The brew was bitter and strange, but it was hot, and there was something deeply satisfying about sharing a morning drink with other people after so many years of solitary breakfasts. They ate in relative silence, a porridge made from gathered nuts and dried berries, supplemented with what looked like root vegetables they'd stored for winter. It wasn't much, but it was prepared with care, and Silas found himself thinking about the contrast between this simple meal shared in companionship and the countless solitary dinners he'd eaten over the years. After breakfast, Luna disappeared upstairs and returned carrying something that made Silas's heart clench with unexpected emotion. It was a doll, crude, handmade from forest materials, but crafted with obvious love and care. The body was stuffed with dried moss and wrapped in scraps of fabric, the face carved from pale wood and painted with berry juice. Tiny braids of real hair had been sewn to its head, and it wore a miniature dress that matched the ones the sisters favored. "I made her the first winter," Luna said, settling the doll carefully in her lap, "when I was still small enough to need something to hold at night. Kira said it was childish, but she helped me braid the hair." "I was 8, Kira said defensively. "I thought I was too old for dolls." But Luna was scared, and it helped her sleep. Silas studied the little figure, seeing in its careful construction all the loneliness and determination of 2 children trying to maintain their humanity in impossible circumstances. The doll wasn't just a toy. It was proof that beneath their survival instincts and wolf-learned behaviors, the sisters had fought to keep the parts of themselves that remained purely human. "She's beautiful," he said sincerely. "What's her name?" "Hope," Luna whispered, as if the word itself was precious. "I named her Hope." The simple statement hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of years spent clinging to the belief that someday, somehow, things might get better. Silas felt his throat tighten, understanding that this small artifact represented everything the sisters had fought to preserve during their long exile from the human world. "I had something similar once," he said quietly. "Not a doll, but a wooden horse my father carved for me when I was about 6. Lost it in a river crossing when I was grown, but I kept it with me for near 30 years. Some things are too important to abandon, no matter how old we get." Luna's grip on the doll relaxed slightly, and she almost smiled. It was the first time Silas had seen either sister's face soften since he'd arrived, and he felt as if he'd been given a precious gift. The moment was interrupted by a sound from outside, not quite natural, not quite human. All 3 of them froze, listening. The sound came again, a low whine that seemed to circle the house like a question. "The pack," Kira said, rising smoothly to her feet. "They want to meet you properly." Silas felt his pulse quicken. He'd faced dangerous animals before, but always as an intruder in their territory, not as someone seeking acceptance into their social structure. "What should I do?" "Come with us," Luna said, tucking the doll carefully into a pocket of her dress. "Let them see that we trust you. But move slowly. Keep your hands visible and don't try to touch them unless they approach you first." They went out through the kitchen door into the crisp morning air. The clearing around the house seemed empty at first, but as Silas's eyes adjusted, he began to pick out shapes among the trees. Wolves, 6 or 7 of them, arranged in a loose semicircle that encompassed the back of the house without quite threatening it. They were magnificent animals, larger than any wolves Silas had seen in his years in the mountains. Their coats thick with winter growth, their eyes intelligent and watchful. The largest, a grizzled female with scars across her muzzle and a bearing that spoke of long leadership, stepped forward. She was massive, easily weighing as much as a small horse. And when she looked at Silas, he felt as if he was being evaluated by something far older and wiser than he'd expected. Luna whistled softly, a sound like wind through pine needles, and the great wolf's attention shifted to her. A conversation began then, not in words but in posture, in the tilt of heads and the position of ears, in sounds that human throats weren't designed to make, but that the sisters produced with obvious fluency. Gradually, the tension in the clearing eased. The pack leader approached Luna first, touching noses with her in a gesture of greeting that was both wild and tender. Then she moved to Kira, repeating the ritual, before finally turning her attention back to Silas. "She's deciding about you," Kira said quietly. "Whether you're safe for us to trust." The wolf approached slowly, each step deliberate and measured. When she was close enough that Silas could feel the warmth of her breath, she stopped and simply looked at him. Her eyes were yellow as old amber, and in them he saw an intelligence that was both alien and oddly familiar, the same watchful wisdom he'd sometimes glimpsed in the sisters' faces. For long moments they regarded each other. Then, apparently reaching some conclusion, the wolf stepped forward and pressed her nose briefly against Silas's outstretched palm. The touch was warm and dry, and when she pulled back, he felt as if he'd just been formally introduced to the true guardian of Wolf Hollow. The other wolves relaxed visibly, some settling onto their haunches, others beginning to explore the edges of the clearing with casual interest. The crisis, if it had been a crisis, was over. "You've been accepted," Luna said, and there was wonder in her voice. "She doesn't do that often. The last time was when she found us as children." "What does it mean?" Silas asked. "It means you're pack now," Kira replied. "It means if someone threatens you, they'll have to answer to her. And it means you're responsible for us the same way we're responsible for you." Silas looked at the sisters, Luna clutching her makeshift doll, Kira standing tall and proud, with wolf acceptance shining in her eyes, and felt something shift in his chest. He'd come to Wolf Hollow looking for a place to retire, a quiet end to a solitary life. Instead, he'd found something he'd never allowed himself to hope for, a family willing to claim him as their own. The great wolf lifted her head and howled once, long and clear, and the sound echoed through the hollow like a declaration. The other wolves joined in, their voices blending into a harmony that spoke of belonging, of bonds that couldn't be broken by distance or time, or the interference of those who would do them harm. Standing in that clearing, surrounded by the wild music of acceptance, Silas Boone realized that his real life was just beginning. 3 days after his acceptance by the pack, Silas learned just how fragile their newfound harmony could be. He'd been working on the mansion's sagging front porch when Luna stumbled out of the forest, her face flushed with fever and her breath coming in harsh, labored gasps. Ira was at her side immediately, supporting her sister's weight as they made their way to the house. "Snake bite," Kira said tersely, helping Luna to sit on the porch steps. Rattler caught her by surprise near the berry thickets. "Got her on the ankle." Silas dropped his hammer and knelt beside Luna, his mind already shifting into the methodical calm that had kept him alive through countless wilderness emergencies. He'd dealt with snake bites before, but always on himself or fellow mountain men who understood the risks. Never on someone who'd become precious to him in the space of a few days. "How long ago?" he asked, gently examining Luna's swollen ankle. The puncture wounds were clearly visible, angry red, and already showing the telltale signs of venom working through her system. "Maybe an hour," Luna whispered, her voice tight with pain. "I tried to walk it off, thought maybe it wasn't that bad." "Bad enough," Silas muttered, noting the way the swelling was creeping up her leg. "We need to get you inside, get you lying down with that leg elevated." "Kira, do you have any whiskey in the house?" "No alcohol," Kira said, her usual composure cracking to show the fear beneath. "We've never needed it before," Silas cursed silently. Whiskey would have helped with both pain and sterilization, but they'd have to make do without it. He lifted Luna carefully, surprised by how light she felt in his arms, and carried her into the parlor where they'd first talked. Kira hurried ahead, arranging cushions and blankets with shaking hands. "My medicine pouch," Silas said, settling Luna on the makeshift bed. "It's in my pack upstairs. Leather bag with beadwork on the front. Bring it down here, quickly." While Kira ran to fetch his supplies, Silas knelt beside Luna and began talking to her in the same calm, steady voice he'd used to talk himself through blizzards and bear encounters. "You're going to be fine," he said, though privately he wasn't certain. Rattlesnake bites could be survivable or fatal, depending on dozens of variables he had no way to measure. "I've got some things in my kit that'll help. Herbs I learned about from a crow medicine man up in the Beartooth Range. Real knowledge, tossed down through generations." Luna's eyes were starting to glaze with fever, but she nodded to show she was listening. "Will it hurt?" she asked, her voice small and young in a way that reminded Silas painfully of the children she and Kira had once been. "Some," he admitted, "but not more than you can handle. You've survived worse than this, Luna. You're stronger than any poisonous snake can carry." Kira returned with his medicine pouch, a worn leather bag decorated with intricate beadwork that had been a gift from the same crow medicine man whose knowledge it contained. Inside were small packets of herbs, roots, and prepared remedies that Silas had collected and carefully preserved over decades of mountain living. He'd never expected to use them to save someone he cared about. Working quickly but carefully, he prepared a poultice from echinacea root and plantain leaves, mixing them with water to form a thick paste. "This goes on the bite," he explained to Kira, who was watching his every movement with desperate attention. "It'll help draw out some of the poison and reduce the swelling." While the poultice worked, he brewed a tea from willow bark and other herbs that would help with Luna's fever and pain. The bitter smell filled the parlor as it steeped, mixing with the wood smoke from the fire Kira had built up to keep Luna warm. "Drink this," he said, supporting Luna's head as she sipped the hot liquid. "I know it tastes terrible, but it'll help your body fight the venom." For the next several hours, Silas maintained a careful vigil, monitoring Luna's breathing, checking the progression of the swelling, replacing the poultice when it dried out. Kira never left her sister's side, holding Luna's hand and whispering words of comfort in a mixture of English and what sounded like the wordless communication language they shared with the wolves. As evening approached, Luna's fever broke. The crisis wasn't over, but the worst of it seemed to have passed. Her breathing eased, the angry red lines creeping up her legs stopped advancing, and she was able to take more of the medicinal tea without struggling. "You did it," Kira whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You saved her." "She saved herself," Silas corrected, though he felt his own eyes growing damp with relief. Strong constitution, good instincts. The medicine just gave her body what it needed to do, what it was already trying to do. But privately he knew how close it had been. Without his knowledge of herbal remedies, without the supplies he'd carried for decades just in case, Luna might not have survived. The thought of losing her, of watching Kira endure yet another devastating loss, made his chest tight with emotions he wasn't prepared to examine too closely. As Luna slept peacefully for the first time since the bite, Kira and Silas sat beside the fire, sharing the exhausted silence of people who'd just weathered a crisis together. "Where did you learn all that?" Kira asked finally. "The herbs, the remedies? Man named Joseph Crow Feather," Silas said, carefully cleaning and repacking his medicine pouch. "Found me half dead from mountain fever during my second winter alone. Could have left me to die, but he didn't. Spent 3 weeks nursing me back to health and teaching me what plants could heal and what plants could kill. Said knowledge like that was too important to die with him. Why did he help you?" Silas considered the question, remembering the old medicine man's weathered face and gentle hands. He said sometimes the spirits put people in our path who need what we can give, and we need what they can teach. Said it was our job to recognize those moments and not waste them. Kira looked at her sleeping sister, then at Silas. "Is that what this is? One of those moments?" "I believe it might be," Silas said quietly. "You and Luna needed someone who could help when the wilderness showed its teeth. I needed," He paused, surprised by the truth he was about to speak. I needed people worth taking care of, worth staying alive for. In the firelight, surrounded by the evidence of crisis weathered and danger overcome, they sat in comfortable understanding. The medicine pouch rested beside them, its beadwork catching the flame's glow, a symbol of knowledge shared across cultures and generations, of the human drive to heal and protect those we love. Outside, a wolf howled softly, and Silas knew that the pack had been watching, waiting, ready to mourn or celebrate depending on how the night unfolded. Now they sang their relief into the darkness, their voices carrying the news that their human pack members were safe, that the bonds between them had grown stronger rather than broken under pressure. Luna stirred in her sleep, murmuring something that sounded like "thank you," before settling back into healing rest. And in that moment, Silas Boone understood that he'd found something in Wolf Hollow that he'd never dared to hope for. A purpose that extended beyond mere survival. A reason to use everything he'd learned in service of something larger than himself. Luna's recovery brought with it a new rhythm to their days at Whitmore Manor. As she regained her strength, the three of them began working together on repairs and improvements to the house with a coordination that surprised Silas. What had started as his solitary effort to make the place livable had evolved into something resembling a true homestead operation. It was during one of these shared work sessions that Silas discovered just how remarkable the sisters' skills had become. They were replacing rotted boards on the back porch when Kira disappeared into the house and returned carrying 3 carved wooden spoons. Their surfaces smooth as silk and their proportions perfect for the work of eating. I made these last winter, she said, offering one to Silas with something that might have been shyness. Thought you might like to have your own, instead of sharing our old bent ones. Silas turned the spoon over in his hands, marveling at the craftsmanship. The wood was cherry, probably salvaged from damaged furniture in the house, and it had been shaped with obvious skill and infinite patience. The handle fit his grip perfectly, as if Kira had somehow measured his hands without him knowing. And the bowl was deep enough to be practical while remaining elegant in its simplicity. This is beautiful work, he said sincerely. Where did you learn to carve like this? Books in Father's library, Kira replied, but her pleased expression suggested the compliment meant more to her than she wanted to admit. There's a whole section on woodworking and furniture making. I practiced on scraps for years before I tried anything useful. We each have our own talents, Luna added, settling carefully onto the porch step. Her ankle was still tender, but the swelling had gone down completely and she could walk without pain. Kira makes things with her hands. I'm better with plants and animals. We complement each other. As the days passed, Silas began to understand the full scope of their complementary skills. Luna knew every edible plant within miles of the house, could predict weather patterns by watching the behavior of birds and insects, and had an almost supernatural ability to find game trails and water sources. Kira was a craftsperson of remarkable ability, able to repair everything from furniture to clothing to the intricate mechanical workings of the old pump that supplied water to the house. Together, they'd created a self-sufficient existence that was both practical and surprisingly comfortable. Their shared meals became elaborate affairs as Luna introduced Silas to wild foods he'd never considered. Tender shoots that tasted like asparagus, roots that could be ground into flour, berries that made excellent preserves when mixed with honey from the wild hives she'd learned to raid. Safely, it was during one of these meals that they heard the sound that would change everything. Hoofbeats on the path leading up to the house, moving slowly and deliberately as if the riders were in no hurry to announce their presence. All 3 of them froze, listening. The wolves had been quiet lately, no warning howls or territorial displays, which meant whoever was coming was either known to them or skilled enough to avoid detection until they were close. How many? Silas asked quietly. Kira cocked her head, her expression intent.
3 horses.
2 riders, maybe 3, moving like they know the way, Could be townspeople, Luna suggested, but her voice carried doubt. Maybe someone's finally come to check on the stories about lights in the cursed house. Silas wasn't convinced. Something about the deliberate pace of the approach suggested purpose rather than casual investigation. He rose from the table and moved to the window that overlooked the front approach. Keeping himself concealed behind the faded curtains, what he saw made his blood run cold. Hank Barrow sat his horse like a man who owned everything the sun touched. His expensive suit somehow managing to look perfectly pressed despite the long ride through the wilderness. Behind him rode two men Silas recognized from the saloon, rough characters who hired themselves out for work that honest men wouldn't do. They were armed, though they weren't making a show of their weapons. "It's Hank," Silas said quietly, "with two of his men. They're not here for a friendly visit." The sisters moved immediately into crisis mode, their earlier relaxation disappearing like morning mist. Luna began gathering the more obvious signs of habitation, the extra dishes, the recently mended clothing that was too small to be Silas's. Kira went to the window and assessed the situation with the calculating gaze of someone who'd spent years watching potential. "Threats. They're staying mounted," she observed. "That suggests they don't plan to be here long, or they want to be ready to leave quickly." "Or both," Silas muttered. He'd dealt with men like Hank Barrow before, bullies who relied on intimidation and superior numbers to get what they wanted. But he'd never faced one while protecting people he'd come to care about. A loud knock echoed through the house, followed by Hank's voice, artificially friendly and carrying clearly through the old walls. "Silas Boone. I know you're in there, old man. We need to talk." Silas looked at the sisters, seeing his own tension reflected in their faces. "Stay hidden," he said quietly. "Don't come out no matter what you hear. If things go badly, take to the forest and wait for the wolves to find you." "We won't abandon you," Kira said fiercely. "You won't be abandoning me," Silas replied. "You'll be staying alive so that someday you can reclaim what's rightfully yours. That's more important than whatever happens to an old mountain man who's already lived longer than he deserved." Luna grasped his arm as he moved toward the door. "Be careful," she whispered. "He's more dangerous than you know." Silas nodded, understanding that she was speaking from painful experience. Whatever Hank Barrow had done to her family, whatever methods he'd used to steal their land and cover up his crimes, he was capable of anything. At the front door, Silas paused to gather himself. The carved wooden spoon Kira had made him was still in his hand, and he slipped it into his pocket where it rested against his hip like a talisman. Whatever happened next, he was no longer just Silas Boone, solitary mountain man. He was part of something larger now, part of a family that depended on him to be strong and smart and absolutely unwilling to back down. He opened the door to find Hank Barrow smiling at him with all the warmth of a snake preparing to strike. Well, Hank said, his voice carrying the kind of jovial menace that made Silas's skin crawl. "Look what we have here. The famous mountain man, playing house in a place that decent folks know better than to visit. We need to have ourselves a conversation, Silas, about property rights, about what belongs to whom, and about what happens to folks who don't understand their place in the natural order of things." Behind Hank, his hired men shifted in their saddles, hands resting casually near their weapons. The message was clear enough. This conversation would go the way Hank wanted it to go, or it would become something much more violent. But Silas Boone had faced down grizzly bears and mountain lions, had survived blizzards and avalanches, had spent more than 6 decades learning that sometimes a man had to make a stand regardless of the odds. And now, for the first time in his life, he had something worth standing for that was more precious than his own survival. The wooden spoon pressed against his hip, a reminder of skill and care and the quiet determination to build something beautiful in a harsh world. Whatever Hank Barrow had come here to do, he was about to learn that some old dogs still had teeth. Silas stepped onto the porch, closing the door firmly behind him. "Hank," he said evenly, neither welcoming nor hostile. "Long way to ride just to check on how I'm settling in. Hank's smile never wavered, but his eyes had gone cold as winter stone. "Oh, I think you'll find I have plenty of reason to be interested in this particular piece of property. See, I've been doing some research since our poker game, and I've discovered some fascinating things about Whitmore Manor." The way he said the name, Whitmore Manor, made it clear that Hank knew exactly whose house this had been. Silas felt his muscles tense, but he kept his expression neutral. Behind him, he hoped the sisters were well hidden and listening carefully to every word. "Such as?" Silas asked. "Such as the fact that Marcus Whitmore never properly filed his will with the county clerk," Hank said, dismounting from his horse with the casual confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Such as the fact that his daughters were declared legally dead after the plague took this place 15 years ago. Such as the fact that this property reverted to the territory, and the territory sold it to me last month for back taxes." Hank reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, waving it like a flag of victory. "This here's the real deed, Silas, the legal one, signed by the territorial governor himself and properly registered with all the right officials. That poker game you think you won, that was just me having a little fun with a worthless piece of paper." Silas felt the ground shift beneath him, not literally, but in every way that mattered. If Hank was telling the truth, and the confident way he was, handling that document suggested he might be, then everything had just become infinitely more complicated. "You're saying the deed you wagered was fake?" "I'm saying it was a copy of the original Whitmore deed, which became null and void the moment those girls died in the plague." Hank's smile turned predatory. "Though I have to admit, I'm curious about why an old mountain man would be so interested in a haunted ruin. Makes a fellow wonder if maybe you know something you haven't been sharing." One of Hank's men, a scarred brute named Pike, who'd been thrown out of every decent saloon between here and Denver, spat into the dust. "Maybe he's just crazy, boss. Mountain men get strange when they spend too much time alone." "Maybe," Hank agreed, but his eyes never left Silas's face. "Or maybe he's been talking to the wrong people, hearing stories that would be better left untold." The threat in those words was unmistakable. Silas realized that this confrontation wasn't really about property rights or legal documents. Hank suspected that someone had survived his murderous purge 15 years ago, and he'd come here to make sure that any loose ends were permanently tied off. "I don't know what stories you're worried about," Silas said carefully, "but if you've got a legal claim to this place, I suppose we'll have to sort it out through proper channels." Hank laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, I don't think we need to involve any lawyers in this, Silas. I think we can settle this between gentlemen." He gestured to his men, who immediately began spreading out to flank the porch. "See, the thing is, I can't have people poking round here, asking questions about what happened during the plague. Bad for my reputation, bad for my business interests, and what business would that be?" "Land acquisition," Hank said simply. "I've been putting together the largest cattle operation in Montana, buying up properties all through this valley. Some folks were happy to sell. Others," he shrugged eloquently, "others required more persuasion." The casual way he admitted to what sounded like a pattern of violence made Silas's blood run cold. But it was what happened next that changed everything. From inside the house came the sound of something falling, not loud, but distinct enough that all 5 men heard it. Hank's head snapped toward the sound, his expression shifting from casual menace to sharp attention. "Thought you said you were alone out here." "Silas, old house," Silas replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Things settle. Wood shifts. You know how it is." But Hank was already moving toward the door, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "Maybe I should take a look around, just to satisfy my curiosity." That's when the second sound came. Unmistakably human, the soft intake of breath that someone might make when trying very hard to remain silent. And with that sound, Silas saw 15 years of careful hiding come to an end. "Well, well," Hank breathed, his eyes lighting up with terrible satisfaction. "It seems the Whitmore plague wasn't quite as thorough as everyone thought." He kicked the door open and strode into the house, leaving Silas no choice but to follow. The scene that greeted them in the parlor would have been almost domestic under other circumstances. Kira and Luna huddled together near the fireplace, Luna still clutching her makeshift doll. Both girls staring at Hank Barrow with expressions of pure hatred. My, Hank said softly. Little Kira and little Luna all grown up. Though I have to say, Living Wild seems to have agreed with you. You're both prettier than I expected you'd turn out. The way he looked at them made Silas's hands clench into fists. But it was the document that Hank pulled from his coat that stopped everyone cold. Not the territorial deed he'd shown outside, but something older, more yellowed, bearing an official-looking seal. Do you know what this is, girls? Hank asked conversationally. This is your father's real will. The one that was supposed to be filed with the county, but somehow never made it there. The one that leaves everything, the house, the land, the mining claims, all of it, to his beloved daughters. Kira found her voice first. You stole it. You murdered our parents and stole our inheritance. I acquired it, Hank corrected, along with several other problematic documents that might have complicated my land purchases. Your father was a meticulous record keeper, I'll give him that. Made quite a paper trail of his holdings and intentions. He moved closer to the sisters, and Silas saw Luna shrink back, pressing herself against Kira's side. The beautiful thing about documents, Hank continued, is that they only matter if there's someone alive to claim what they promise. For 15 years, I thought I'd solved that particular problem permanently. But now we have a dilemma, he said, turning to include Silas in his audience. Because if these girls are alive, and if this will somehow surface in a court of law, well, that would cause me considerable inconvenience. All those properties I've been accumulating, all those business arrangements I've made based on clear ownership, suddenly everything becomes much more complicated. Silas understood with crystal clarity what Hank was really saying. The sisters weren't just witnesses to their parents' murder. They were legal heirs to a fortune that Hank had been systematically stealing piece by piece for a decade and a half. Their continued existence threatened not just his current holdings, but the entire criminal empire he'd built on forged documents and convenient deaths. So here's what's going to happen, Hank said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than shouting would have. You're all going to disappear, quietly, permanently, and in a way that ensures no inconvenient questions get asked later. Pike here is very good at arranging accidents. Pike grinned, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. Real good at accidents, boss. Especially the kind that happen to folks who've been living rough in dangerous country. But as Hank reached for the will, preparing to consign it to the fire that crackled in the grate, Kira spoke up with a confidence that surprised everyone in the room. That's not the only copy. Hank froze, his hand inches from the flames. What? Our father wasn't stupid, Kira continued, her voice growing stronger. He knew men like you existed. He made copies of everything important and hid them where you'd never think to look. That will you're holding? It's one of 3. The other 2 are in places where honest people will find them if anything happens to us. Luna joined her sister's defiance, clutching her doll tighter. And we wrote down everything we remember about the night you killed our parents. Every detail. Those accounts are hidden with the wills. For the first time since his arrival, Hank Barrow looked uncertain. The confident predator had been replaced by a man calculating odds that had suddenly shifted against him. And in that moment of uncertainty, Silas realized that the sisters had been planning for this confrontation much longer than he'd imagined. They'd been preparing for the day when their past would catch up with them, and they'd been smart enough to create insurance against exactly this scenario. The game had changed completely, and none of them would emerge unchanged from what was about to unfold. The silence that followed Luna's declaration stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. Hank Barrow's face cycled through a range of emotions, surprise, calculation, and finally a cold fury that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. You're bluffing, he said finally. But there was uncertainty in his voice that hadn't been there before. Are we? Kira asked, moving slightly to put herself between Hank and her sister. You spent 15 years thinking you were so clever, covering your tracks, making sure no one would ever connect you to what happened here. But you forgot something important, which is... Children see everything, Luna said quietly. And we remembered everything. Every word you spoke to our father before you poisoned the well. Every lie you told the authorities afterward. Every document you forged to steal what belonged to our family. Hank's hand moved to his gun, but Silas was already shifting position, placing himself where he could intervene if violence erupted. The old mountain man might not be as fast as he once was, but he was still dangerous enough to make Hank think twice about drawing iron in close quarters. Where? Hank demanded. Where did you hide these supposed copies? Kira smiled, and for the first time since Silas had known her, she looked genuinely pleased. You know what's funny about living with wolves for 15 years? You learn to think like pack animals. You learn to cache resources in multiple locations, to always have escape routes planned, to never put all your eggs in one basket. The banker in Helena has one set, Luna added, her voice gaining confidence. Sealed envelope, instructions to open it if anything happens to the Whitmore family. Mr. Jameson was a friend of her father's, honest man who never believed the plague story, she said. Second set is with the territorial marshal in Virginia City, Kira continued, along with a letter explaining exactly why we've been hiding all these years and from whom. Hank's face was turning an unhealthy shade of red. You're lying. If you'd really done all that, why hide? Why not come forward years ago? Because we were children, Kira said simply. Because we knew you had money and influence and friends in high places. Because we knew that if we surfaced too early, you'd find a way to silence us permanently before anyone could act on what we knew. But we're not children anymore, Luna said, and there was steel in her voice that reminded Silas powerfully of her sister. And we've been preparing for this day since we were old enough to understand what you stole from us. Silas watched Hank's hired men growing increasingly nervous as the conversation progressed. Pike kept glancing toward the door, as if calculating whether they could make a quick exit if things went sideways. The other man, a lean scarecrow named Daniels, was sweating despite the cool air. Even if what you're saying is true, Hank said, clearly struggling to regain control of the situation. Those documents won't matter if the people who wrote them aren't around to verify their authenticity. Actually, they will, a new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to see a man in a dark suit standing in the entrance to the parlor, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of bearing that suggested authority and the confidence that came with it. Behind him stood two other men, both wearing deputy marshal badges that caught the firelight. Marshal Henderson, Hank said, and Silas could hear the strain in his voice. What brings you all the way out to Wolf Hollow? Funny thing, Hank, the marshal replied, stepping into the room with the careful movements of a man who expected trouble. Got a telegraph message this morning from Helena. Seems a banker named Jameson had some concerns about the welfare of certain parties he'd been expecting to hear from. He glanced at the sisters, and his expression softened slightly. Miss Kira, Miss Luna, Mr. Jameson sends his regards and wants you to know that your instructions have been followed to the letter. Silas felt the pieces clicking into place. The sisters hadn't just been hiding for 15 years. They'd been building a network of allies, preparing for exactly this moment. The scared, feral girls he'd first encountered were nowhere to be seen. In their place stood young women who'd orchestrated this confrontation with the patience and cunning of master strategists. Now then, Marshal Henderson continued, his attention returning to Hank, I believe we have some business to discuss regarding property fraud, document forgery, and the suspicious deaths of Marcus and Elizabeth Whitmore. Hank's hand was definitely on his gun now, and Silas could see the wheels turning in the man's head as he calculated his options. None of them were good. He was outnumbered, outflanked, and facing the collapse of everything he'd built through 15 years of careful criminality. This is all very interesting, Hank said slowly, but I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. These girls have been living wild for years. Who knows what fantasies they've concocted? What court would take the word of two half-savage? He never finished the sentence. Kira moved with fluid grace, pulling something from beneath the fireplace mantel where it had been hidden in plain sight. It was a rifle, not one of the modern repeating weapons that were becoming common, but an older model that had been meticulously maintained and obviously well used. "This was our father's rifle," she said, holding it with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been trained in its use. "The one he used to hunt the very wolves that later saved our lives. The one he would have used to defend his family if you'd given him a fair chance. It still shoots true," Luna added, and Silas noticed that she'd somehow acquired a revolver from somewhere. "We've had plenty of time to practice." The deputies had their own weapons drawn now, creating a standoff that could only end in bloodshed. But it was what happened next that truly demonstrated just how thoroughly the sisters had planned for this moment. From outside came a sound that made everyone except Silas, and the sisters freeze with primal fear, the deep, resonant howl of a wolf, answered immediately by another, then another, until the entire hollow rang with their voices. It wasn't the casual calling that Silas had grown accustomed to. This was the coordinated cry of a pack on the hunt. "They're here," Luna whispered, and there was satisfaction in her voice. "We called them before you arrived, Mr. Barrow. Told them that the man who killed our parents had finally come home." Through the windows, shapes could be seen moving in the gathering dusk, large forms padding silently through the trees surrounding the house. The pack had come, summoned by their human family members, ready to defend what they'd protected for 15 years. Hank's men were openly terrified now. Pike's gun hand was shaking, and Daniels looked ready to bolt, despite the deputies blocking the only exit. "You can't control them," Hank said desperately. "Wild animals don't follow orders." "These aren't wild animals," Kira corrected. "They're family, and family protects family." Marshal Henderson seemed to be the only person in the room besides Silas who wasn't intimidated by the wolf song. "I think we've heard enough," he said calmly. "Hank Barrow, you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and suspected murder. Deputy Morrison, would you please relieve Mr. Barrow and his associates of their weapons?" But Hank wasn't finished yet. With the desperate cunning of a cornered rat, he suddenly lunged toward Luna, clearly intending to use her as a hostage to negotiate his way out of the trap that had closed around him. He never made it. Silas moved with a speed that surprised everyone, including himself. 63 years of mountain living had taught him to react without thinking when danger threatened, and his walking stick caught Hank across the temple with a solid crack that dropped the man to his knees. At the same moment, Kira's father's rifle swung to cover Pike and Daniels, who suddenly found themselves facing not just the deputies' guns, but a weapon held by someone who clearly knew how to use it. "I wouldn't," she said simply, and something in her voice, the cold certainty of someone who'd already lost everything once and refused to lose it again, convinced both men to raise their hands in surrender. Outside, the wolf song reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very walls of the manor, then gradually faded to silence. The pack had delivered their message and were content to wait for the outcome. "Well," Marshal Henderson said into the sudden quiet, "that was considerably more exciting than I expected." He gestured to his deputies. "Morrison, Caldwell, let's get these men secured. I believe we have quite a story to hear from Miss Kira and Miss Luna." As the deputies moved to arrest Hank and his men, Silas found himself looking at the rifle in Kira's hands, the father's rifle that had served as both weapon and symbol of their determination to reclaim their birthright. It represented everything they'd fought to preserve: memory, justice, and the strength to face their demons when the time finally came. The climax was building, and everyone in the room understood that the next few moments would determine not just who lived and who died, but whether 15 years of injustice would finally be set right. The arrest should have ended everything, but Hank Barrow had spent 15 years building his criminal empire and wasn't about to surrender it without a fight. As Deputy Morrison moved to place shackles on his wrists, Hank suddenly threw himself sideways, knocking over the oil lamp that had been providing most of the room's light. The lamp shattered against the stone hearth, spreading burning oil across the old wooden floor in a wave of orange flame. In the sudden chaos of flickering light and rising smoke, Pike broke free from Deputy Caldwell's grasp and lunged for the rifle Luna had dropped when helping her sister maintain her aim on the prisoners. "Luna!" Kira shouted, swinging her father's rifle toward Pike. But the smoke was already making it hard to see clearly. The room erupted into violence as 15 years of careful planning collided with desperate improvisation. Marshal Henderson dove to tackle Hank, who was scrambling toward the door on hands and knees. Deputy Morrison found himself grappling with Daniels, both men rolling dangerously close to the spreading flames. Silas moved to protect the sisters, his walking stick ready to club anyone who threatened them. But it was the sound from outside that truly changed the dynamics of the fight. Not howling this time, but the sharp crack of a carved horn being blown in a specific pattern that Luna had obviously practiced many times before. The wolf pack howl horn that she'd pulled from her dress pocket sent a signal that every wolf in the hollow understood. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The front door, which Marshal Henderson had left ajar, suddenly burst open as the pack leader bounded into the room. Behind her came 3 more wolves, their eyes reflecting the firelight as they took in the scene of chaos and violence. Pike screamed and stumbled backward, dropping the rifle he'd been reaching for. No amount of criminal experience had prepared him for facing down a wolf pack in an enclosed space. The great female padded forward, her lips pulled back to reveal teeth that could crush a man's arm, and positioned herself between the sisters and their attackers. "Easy, girl," Luna called softly, even as she retrieved the dropped rifle. "Protect, but don't kill unless we have no choice." The wolf's ears flicked at the sound of Luna's voice, acknowledging the command, while keeping her attention fixed on the men who threatened her human family. The other wolves spread out through the room, cutting off escape routes and creating a living barrier of fur, muscle, and barely contained violence. Hank had managed to reach the doorway, but found himself face to face with 2 more pack members who'd positioned themselves in the entrance hall. His face went pale as he realized that his carefully planned escape route had been blocked by creatures that answered to a higher authority than human law. "Call them off," he shouted desperately. "This is madness." "The madness started 15 years ago," Kira replied, her father's rifle now trained steadily on Hank's chest. "When you decided that murder was an acceptable business practice, the fire was spreading across the parlor floor, forcing everyone to crowd toward the center of the room where the wolves maintained their protective formation. Smoke was beginning to fill the air, and Silas could see that they'd have to resolve this confrontation quickly before the house became uninhabitable. "Marshal," he called through the thickening smoke, "we need to get everyone outside before this whole room goes up." "Agreed," Henderson replied, still wrestling with a surprisingly slippery Hank Barrow. "But I'm not leaving without my prisoners." That's when Pike made his fatal mistake. Panicked by the fire, the smoke, and the wolves surrounding him, he pulled a hidden derringer from his boot and aimed it not at the deputies or even at Silas, but directly at Luna. "I'll kill the girl," he screamed. "Call off these beasts or she dies." The pack leader's response was instant and terrible. She launched herself at Pike with a speed that human eyes could barely follow, her powerful jaws clamping down on his gun arm before he could pull the trigger. Pike's scream echoed through the burning room as the derringer clattered harmlessly across the floor. "Luna, call her back." Silas shouted, seeing that the wolf's protective instincts were about to turn lethal, but it was Kira who acted, putting her fingers to her lips and producing a sharp whistle that cut through the chaos like a blade. The pack leader immediately released Pike's mangled arm and backed away, though she remained poised to attack again if he made another threatening move. Pike collapsed to his knees, clutching his wounded arm and sobbing. "She broke it," he whimpered. "The beast broke my arm." "Consider yourself lucky," Marshal Henderson said grimly, finally managing to get handcuffs on Hank. "If you'd actually shot that girl, they'd have torn you apart before any of us could stop them." The fire was growing more serious now, licking at the old wallpaper and sending tendrils of flame up toward the ceiling. The smoke was thick enough that everyone was coughing, and it was clear they had only minutes before the room became completely untenable. "Everyone out!" Silas commanded, taking charge of the evacuation. "Wolves first, then the prisoners, then us. Stay together and watch for more trouble." As they began the organized retreat from the burning parlor, Luna touched the carved horn that hung around her neck, the artifact that had summoned their salvation in the moment of greatest danger. It represented the unique bond between human and wild, the alliance that had protected her family for 15 years and would continue to protect them as they finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light of justice. The climax was far from over, but the first phase had been won through courage, preparation, and the loyalty of those who understood that some bonds transcended the boundaries between species. The evacuation from the burning parlor moved with surprising efficiency, considering the chaos of the preceding minutes. The wolves led the way, padding silently through the smoke-filled hallway toward the front door, their pack instincts ensuring that escape routes remained clear. Behind them came the prisoners, Pike whimpering over his mangled arm, Daniels white-faced with shock, and Hank Barrow moving with the careful steps of a man who understood that his empire was crumbling around him. Once outside in the clear mountain air, Marshal Henderson took control of the situation with the practiced calm of a man who dealt with desperate criminals before. His deputies quickly secured the prisoners, while the sisters worked to calm their wolf family, who remained agitated by the scent of smoke and the memory of violence. But Hank Barrow wasn't finished yet. As Deputy Morrison bent to check his shackles, Hank suddenly straightened and drove his knee upward, catching the deputy in the solar plexus and doubling him over. In the same motion, he twisted away from the stunned lawman and made a desperate dash toward the horses that still waited where his group had left them. "Stop him!" Marshal Henderson shouted, but Hank had a crucial head start and the desperate speed of a man with nothing left to lose. The pack leader reacted instantly to the renewed threat, bounding after Hank with ground-eating strides that closed the distance between them in seconds. But Hank had reached his horse and managed to swing into the saddle just as powerful jaws snapped at the animal's flanks. The horse reared and plunged, terrified by the wolf's proximity, but Hank was an experienced rider who managed to stay mounted. He spurred the animal toward the forest trail, apparently believing that he could still escape into the wilderness and disappear as he'd done so many times before. That's when Kira demonstrated just how thoroughly she'd learned the lessons of survival and strategy that 15 years in Wolf Hollow had taught her. From her position near the porch, she raised her father's rifle and fired a single, carefully aimed shot that sent Hank's hat spinning away into the darkness. "The next one won't miss," she called after him, already working the rifle's action to chamber another round. "And neither will the ones after that." But it wasn't Kira's marksmanship that ultimately stopped Hank Barrow's escape attempt. It was Luna, standing quietly in the moonlight with something metallic gleaming in her hand. As Hank's horse thundered past her position, she held up what looked like an ornate seal or stamp, its surface catching the light from the burning house. "Looking for this?" she called, her voice carrying clearly through the night air. Hank jerked his horse to a halt so violently that the animal nearly stumbled. When he turned to stare at what Luna was holding, his face went through a series of expressions that ended in defeated recognition. "That's impossible," he said hoarsely. "I destroyed that years ago." "You destroyed a copy," Luna replied calmly. "Just like you thought you destroyed the will. But our father was smarter than you gave him credit for. He hid the real inheritance seal where no greedy murderer would ever think to look for it." Silas moved closer to get a better view of what Luna was holding. The inheritance seal was an intricate piece of metalwork, obviously crafted by a master jeweler, bearing the Whitmore family crest and what appeared to be an official territorial stamp. Even in the uncertain light, it was clearly a document of tremendous legal significance. "Without this," Kira explained, her rifle still trained on Hank, "none of your forged papers matter. This seal proves that we are who we say we are, and that everything you've stolen belongs to us by right of inheritance. More importantly, Marshal Henderson added, approaching with his own weapon drawn, it proves that every land deal you've made in the past 15 years was fraudulent. Every acre you claimed, every property you bought with money stolen from the Whitmore estate, every business arrangement you made based on false documentation, all of it becomes void the moment this seal is presented to a territorial court. Hank's shoulders sagged as the full implications hit him. He wasn't just facing arrest for the murders of Marcus and Elizabeth Whitmore. He was facing the complete collapse of everything he'd built, the unwinding of a criminal enterprise that stretched across half of Montana. "You don't understand," he said desperately, his earlier confidence completely gone. "There are other people involved. Powerful people. If they find out I've been caught, if they think I might testify against them, then you'd better hope the territorial prison has good security," Henderson replied unsympathetically, "because that's where you're going to be spending the rest of your natural life." The pack had formed a loose circle around the entire group now, their yellow eyes reflecting the firelight as they watched the drama play out. To Silas, they looked like ancient spirits bearing witness to justice finally being served after years of patience and preparation. As the deputies secured Hank and prepared to transport the prisoners back to town, Luna walked over to where Silas stood watching the controlled chaos. The inheritance seal remained in her hand, solid proof of everything the sisters had fought to reclaim. "It's really over," she said softly, and for the first time since he'd known her, she sounded like the young woman she was, rather than the hardened survivor she'd been forced to become. "It's over," Silas agreed, putting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You and Kira can finally stop hiding. You can finally go home." Luna looked back at the burning house, then at her sister, then at the wolves who'd raised them, and the man who'd helped them reclaim their birthright. "We are home," she said simply. "We've been home all along." The climax had reached its resolution. Justice had been served, and the Whitmore sisters were free at last. 3 months later, Silas stood on the rebuilt front porch of Whitmore Manor, watching the morning sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The house behind him hummed with purposeful activity. Kira's voice drifting from the kitchen where she was preparing breakfast. Luna's laughter mixing with the sound of hammering as she worked on the new addition they were building to accommodate their expanded family. The fire damage had been extensive, but not fatal. The parlor would need to be completely rebuilt, and smoke had stained much of the first floor, but the structure itself remained sound. More importantly, the insurance money that Marshal Henderson had helped them recover from Hank's various accounts had provided more than enough funds to restore the manor to its former glory, and then some. Silas pulled the simple sketch from his shirt pocket and studied it in the morning light. It wasn't much to look at, just pencil lines on paper showing 3 figures standing together in front of a house. But Luna had drawn it with careful attention to detail, and it showed something that would have been impossible to imagine just a few months earlier, a family portrait that included all of them. In the sketch, Kira stood tall and confident, her father's rifle resting in the crook of her arm. No longer a weapon of desperate defense, but a symbol of heritage reclaimed. Luna was beside her, one hand touching the wolf collar at her throat, the other reaching toward the great pack leader who sat at her feet like a faithful guardian. And there was Silas himself, his walking stick planted firmly in the ground, his weathered face wearing an expression of contentment that surprised him every time he looked at it. "New family portrait," Luna had said when she'd presented it to him the previous evening, "to replace the torn one we found in the library." The sketch represented something unprecedented in Silas's long life, belonging that went deeper than mere survival or convenience. He'd spent 6 decades believing that solitude was his natural state, that attachment to others only led to loss and pain. But the sisters had taught him that family could be chosen as well as inherited, that bonds forged in mutual respect and shared purpose could be stronger than those created by accident of birth. The sound of approaching horses drew his attention to the main trail, where a familiar figure was riding toward the house. Marshal Henderson had become a regular visitor since the trials ended, partly in his official capacity as he helped the sisters navigate the legal complexities of reclaiming their inheritance, but also because he'd developed what he called a professional interest in their unique approach to frontier justice. "Morning, Silas," Henderson called as he dismounted. "The ladies around?" "Kitchen and workshop respectively," Silas replied, gesturing toward the sounds of domestic activity. "Coffee's on if you want some." Henderson accepted the invitation, settling into one of the chairs they'd arranged on the porch for exactly this sort of informal consultation. "Got some news from the territorial capital," he said, pulling a letter from his coat. "Thought you'd want to hear it directly." Silas felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The legal proceedings following Hank's arrest had been complicated and far-reaching. Evidence discovered in Hank's files had implicated dozens of other parties in the systematic fraud that had plagued the territory for years. Several prominent businessmen and at least one territorial official were currently awaiting trial, and there was always the possibility that some of Hank's more violent associates might decide to seek revenge against the witnesses who'd brought their empire crashing down. "What kind of news?" Silas asked. "The good kind," Henderson replied with a slight smile. "Hank Barrow died in territorial prison 3 days ago. Heart gave out, according to the prison doctor. Natural causes, no foul play suspected." Silas absorbed this information with mixed feelings. Part of him was relieved that the man who'd murdered the sisters' parents and stolen their inheritance was finally beyond the reach of earthly justice. But another part, the part that had learned about family and forgiveness from watching Kira and Luna rebuild their lives, felt something approaching pity for a man who died alone and hated, surrounded by the wreckage of his own choices. "How will the girls take it?" Henderson asked, apparently reading something in Silas's expression. "Better than you might expect," Silas replied. "They've both got more wisdom about justice and mercy than most folks twice their age. They wanted him stopped, wanted the truth to come out, but they never took pleasure in the idea of his suffering." As if summoned by their conversation, Kira and Luna emerged from the house, drawn by the sound of Henderson's voice. Both sisters had changed dramatically over the past few months, not just in their clothing, which was now store-bought rather than handmade from scavenged materials, but in their bearing and confidence. They moved through the world now as the wealthy landowners they'd always been by right, but they'd retained the grace and quiet strength that 15 years of wilderness living had given them. "Marshal Henderson," Kira said warmly, offering him a cup of coffee. "What brings you back to Wolf Hollow so soon?" Henderson delivered his news with gentle directness, watching their faces for signs of how they were processing the information. To his credit, he'd learned not to underestimate the emotional resilience of the Whitmore sisters. "I'm glad he's at peace," Luna said finally, and she seemed to mean it. "Hatred is a burden that gets heavier the longer you carry it. We decided months ago that we wouldn't let it poison what we were building here." "What we've built," Kira corrected, looking around at the restored manor, the thriving gardens, the workshop where she'd been crafting furniture to replace what had been damaged in the fire. "This isn't just our home anymore. It's a place where people who've lost their way can find each other and start over." That was true, though Silas suspected the sisters didn't fully realize the scope of what they were creating. Word had begun to spread through the territory about the women in Wolf Hollow who'd reclaimed their inheritance with the help of wolves and an old mountain man. People came to visit, some seeking legal advice about their own property disputes, others simply curious about the family that lived in harmony with wild creatures. All were welcomed with the same patient hospitality that had first drawn Silas into their circle. "Speaking of which," Henderson said, pulling another document from his coat, "I've got the final papers transferring the last of Hank's fraudulent acquisitions back to their rightful owners. Your family's land holdings are now completely restored and properly registered with the territorial government." He handed the papers to Kira, who accepted them with the same calm dignity she brought to everything else. Thank you, Marshal, for everything you've done to help us reclaim our heritage. Thank you for reminding an old lawman that justice isn't always about punishment, Henderson replied. Sometimes it's about giving people the chance to heal and build something better. As the Marshal prepared to leave, promising to return soon with his wife, who was eager to meet the famous Wolf sisters, Silas found himself reflecting on the strange turns his life had taken. He'd come to Wolf Hollow expecting to find a quiet place to spend his remaining years. Instead, he discovered that his real life had been waiting for him all along, not in solitude, but in the complicated, rewarding, sometimes challenging work of being part of a family. The new family portrait in his pocket rustled as he shifted position, and he smiled to think how different it looked from the torn original they'd found in the library. That first portrait had shown the formal arrangement of people related by blood and circumstance. This new one showed something rarer and more precious, people who'd chosen each other deliberately, who'd fought for the right to be together, who'd built their bonds strong enough to survive anything the world might throw at them. In the distance, a wolf howled its greeting to the morning, answered by the voices of the pack that still roamed the hollow. But now the sound carried no threat, only the wild music of belonging that had become the soundtrack to their new life together. Silas Boone had finally found his way home.